On a deserted Georgia highway, Deputy Sheriff Rick Grimes drives his police cruiser past overturned and damaged cars scattered on the road, which forces him to stop. He gets out of the car and takes a can of gasoline out of the trunk. He walks past the remains of wrecked and abandoned cars down the hill to the gas station. Various corpses and garbage are scattered around the gas station, where a homemade sign with the inscription "No Gas" hangs. Rick looks around when suddenly he hears something and crouches behind the car. He sees on the other side of the car the bare feet of a little girl who picks up a teddy bear from the ground. He gets up and sees that the girl is leaving, so he comes closer to her. Rick keeps calling her until she turns to face him. Her lips and right cheek are torn, exposing exposed teeth and muscles. Rick's face drops as she starts to approach him, growling. She approaches faster, he steps back, pulls out his Colt Python and shoots her in the head. As her body falls to the floor, Rick lowers the gun. About 2 months earlier, Rick and his partner and best friend Shane Walsh are eating hamburgers and French fries in their police car. They joke about the differences between men and women. When the conversation turns to Rick's wife, Lori, he turns somber. He says they've been fighting lately, and says that morning Lori accused him of not taking care of his family in the presence of their son Carl. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie turns on, reporting an impending high-speed chase involving 2 armed suspects. Rick and Shane are getting ready to stop the criminals. Rick and Shane drop the food and rush to the crime scene. Arriving at the place, they lay a studded strip and meet with their colleagues Lambert Kendall and Leon Bassett. While they're all waiting for the car, Leon reflects on their chances of getting on a reality show about police chases. Rick advises him to focus and worry about having a cartridge in the chamber of the gun and the safety off. At this moment, a car pulls up, pursued by 2 more cars, in which there are employees of the Linden County Sheriff's Department. A car with suspects inside overcomes a lane with spikes at speed, punching tires. The driver loses control of the controls, and the car pulls off the road, turning over several times, after which it roughly stops with its wheels up in the field. Rick cautiously approaches the overturned car. A man gets out of the car and immediately starts shooting at the officers. Rick yells at him to drop the gun, but he shoots right at Rick and hits him in the chest. Shane shoots the shooter, killing him, and Rick falls to the ground. The second man gets out of the car with a shotgun, but is also shot. Rick discovers that there is nothing wrong with him, since he was wearing a bulletproof vest. He asks Shane not to tell Laura about what happened. Meanwhile, the third shooter, unnoticed by everyone, crawls out of the car and makes his way through the grass. He fires a pistol and hits Rick in the side, where he is not protected by a bulletproof vest. He falls to the ground, bleeding, and Shane shoots the third and kills him, after which he rushes to Rick's aid. He begs Rick to stay with him, shouts at Leon to call an ambulance, but Rick remains motionless. Some time later, Shane brings Rick flowers to the hospital, but Rick does not regain consciousness until Shane starts talking to him. After an unknown time, Rick wakes up and reacts to Shane's presence. He discovers that Shane is no more. The flowers withered and died, the beeps of the machine stopped, like the clock. The ward is empty. Weak, dehydrated and lonely, Rick gets out of bed and falls to the floor. He calls the nurse to help him, but no one comes. Rick manages to get up, and he stumbles into the bathroom, drinks water directly from the tap, and then heads for the door. Opening the door, he notices that the entrance to the ward is blocked by a gurney. He pushes her aside and continues walking down the dark and disheveled corridor. Lights flicker in the hallway, wires hang from the ceiling. He goes to the nurse's post and tries to make a phone call, but it doesn't work. He finds a set of matches and looks for something else to take from the table. Suddenly, a flickering light attracts his attention, and through the doorway Rick sees the nurse's devastated body, stripped of most of the skin. Rick steps back in horror. Continuing down the corridor, he sees that the walls are covered with blood with numerous bullet holes. The double door leading to the dining room is chained shut. A message is scrawled on it in black paint: not to open, dead inside. A pair of gray disheveled hands penetrates through the cracks and fiddles with the lock and chains, moans and groans when all the new fingers with a growl penetrate through the cracks. Terrified, Rick steps back. He tries to get into the elevator, but it doesn't work, so he exits through a heavy door onto a dark landing that smells of rotting flesh. Choking on the smell, he descends the stairs, lighting matches until he finds a way out. At the back of the hospital, a door opens onto a loading dock. As Rick's eyes adjust to the bright sunlight, he sees hundreds of decomposed, fly-covered bodies wrapped in sheets and stacked in rows and piles. He leaves the hospital and stumbles up the hill. There is a military helicopter, sandbags and other signs of a military cordon, but everything has been abandoned. He wanders along the road in a hospital gown and notices an overturned bicycle in the park. When he reaches out to him, the badly decomposed body of a mutilated woman without legs and lips turns and reaches out to him, moaning and growling piteously. Rick falls off his bike from fright, but after a moment he regains consciousness, gets on his bike and hurriedly drives away. Rick rides his bike to his house and discovers that the front door is open and there is no one in the house. Sobbing on the floor, he calls for Lori and Carl, doubting whether it's all real or if he's dreaming. He leaves the house and sits on the steps. He notices a man stumbling on the road and waves his hand, trying to get his attention. At this moment, a boy sneaks up behind him and hits him with a shovel. The boy's father, Morgan Jones, approaches the stumbling man Rick was waving at and shoots him in the head. Then he approaches the scream and points the revolver in his face, demanding to explain why his side is bandaged, but Rick loses consciousness before he can answer. Later that night, Rick wakes up with his arms and legs tied to the bed. A young guy, Dwayne, stands guard with a baseball bat. Morgan came in and asked if he had been bitten. Rick informs him that he has been wounded and is therefore bandaged. Morgan frees him from the bonds, but warns that he will kill him if he tries to do something. Rick recognizes the house they are in as the home of his neighbors Fred and Cindy Drake. Rick then accuses Morgan of murder for shooting the man Rick was waving at. But Morgan says the man was a walker. He expresses regret about firing a gun, as it will attract even more walkers. He warns Rick not to open the shutters he has hung on the window, as walkers outside will see the light and will be attracted to the house. While they are having dinner, Morgan realizes that Rick doesn't know what happened and informs him about what happened. During Rick's stay in a coma, recently deceased people suddenly began to come to life and devour innocent people, and turn others into walkers like them through bites. Eventually, this led to a worldwide social collapse in which walkers began to dominate. Morgan tells Rick what will happen if you are bitten by a walker, claiming that as a result of the fever you will burn, and then die and turn back into a walker. Morgan claims he saw it happen. But he refuses to answer with whom exactly. Suddenly, the car alarm goes off, and Dwayne turns off the lights in the house, and Rick and Morgan look out through tightly closed windows and boarded doors. The street is filled with walkers attracted by the alarm noise. When a woman in a nightgown appears and approaches the front door of the house, Dwayne runs away in tears. Morgan comforts her son, and Rick looks at the woman through the peephole of the front door. The woman looks around and tries to turn the door handle, but eventually gives up and leaves. Morgan remorsefully tells Rick that the walker was his wife and when she died, he couldn't bring himself to kill her and let her go so she could wander the streets. The next morning, Rick goes outside in a protective mask and with a baseball bat. Finding a walker nearby, Morgan tells Rick that the only way to finally kill a walker is to destroy his brain. Rick walks up to the walker and repeatedly hits his head with a bat until he dies. He gets tired quickly, most likely due to a non-healing gunshot wound. Back at Rick's house, he tells Morgan that he thinks his wife and son are still alive. He explains that he found empty drawers in the bedrooms, and family photos and photo albums disappeared. Morgan laughs at this, mentioning that his wife did the same thing when they evacuated. Dwayne suggests to Rick that they might be in Atlanta. Morgan explains that the government told people to go to the refugee center with military protection and food until the broadcast stopped. He also explains that the Center for Disease Control is rumored to be working on a cure. Rick, Morgan and Dwayne go to the King County Sheriff's Department, where they enjoy a hot shower thanks to a separate propane heating system. While they are getting dressed, Morgan tells Rick that his family was heading to Atlanta, but he and Dwayne never got there because they got stuck after his wife was bitten, and after her death they stayed at the Drake house. After that, Rick collects a duffel bag with weapons and changes into a sheriff's uniform and hat. He hands Morgan the rifle and ammunition. They go outside and start loading weapons into the trunk of his car. Rick is getting ready to go to Atlanta, and Morgan says that he will follow him in a few days when Dwayne learns how to shoot. Rick hands Morgan a walkie-talkie and tells him to turn it on every day at dawn to establish communication. Before leaving, Morgan warns Rick that sometimes walkers can gather in a herd, which can be dangerous if you meet them unprepared. Then Rick notices a revived Leon, who has clawed at the chain-link fence separating them. Rick admits that he does not think too highly of the young officer, but he will not leave him in this state. He shoots a revolver into the forehead of the revived Leon, laying him on the ground. Then she and Morgan drive away from the sheriff's department in different directions. Back at the Drake house, Morgan boards up the doors and Dwayne closes the windows before dark. Morgan then goes up to the attic with the rifle that Rick left him. He looks at old photo albums and photos of his wife. Then he raises his rifle and starts shooting at several walkers in the hope of luring out his revived wife. However, when she appears, Morgan breaks down and cannot bring himself to kill her. Rick returns to the park where he found a legless walker. After following the blood trail for quite a long distance, he finds her again, helplessly crawling. She reaches out to him uselessly. Rick apologizes to the walker for what happened to her, and then remorsefully puts her down with a shot to the head. Later, heading to Atlanta on Highway 85, Rick sends messages by radio from his car. In a camp outside the city, a group of survivors receives a transmission. Young blonde Amy runs to the walkie-talkie, but can't answer. Shane, Lori, and Carl are among the survivors, but they do not recognize Rick's voice from the distorted transmission. By the time Shane picks up the walkie-talkie and introduces himself, Rick has already left the emergency broadcast channel. Lori says she's been saying for a week that signs should be put up on the highway warning people to leave town, and voluntarily agrees to go herself, but Dale and Shane object that it's too risky. Lori leaves, and Shane follows her. Inside the tent, Shane tells Lori that she has to hold herself together for Carl, who has already lost so much. Lori agrees and they kiss passionately until Carl interrupts them without seeing their kiss. Lori promises him that she won't go anywhere, and tells her son to go finish his business. He runs away, smiling. Rick runs out of fuel on the road, so he dumps the car on the highway and sets off on foot with a can of gasoline and a duffel bag full of weapons, not forgetting to grab a family photo that he holds over the rearview mirror and hide it in his jacket pocket. He approaches the farmhouse in search of gasoline. He looks in the window, where he discovers that the couple committed suicide. Rick tries to find the keys to the pickup truck parked in the driveway, but instead finds a horse on the property. He gets into the saddle and makes the rest of the way to Atlanta with a bag of weapons slung over his shoulder. Arriving in Atlanta, he discovers that there is no safe zone, as described by Morgan and Dwayne. The whole city is abandoned, the streets are littered with corpses and abandoned military vehicles. Several walkers notice Rick and start chasing him. Suddenly Rick notices the reflection of a helicopter flying past a skyscraper. He speeds up his horse to try to follow him, but eventually comes across a large herd of walkers. He does not have time to escape and falls to the floor when the walkers begin to devour the horse. While the walkers are distracted, he manages to get under an abandoned tank. Several walkers notice him and start reaching for him from under the tank. Rick shoots several of them, but the walker quickly outnumbers him. Having no other choice, Rick decides to shoot himself in the head until he notices a hatch under the tank. He quickly climbs into it to escape from the walkers. Resting inside the tank, Rick takes the weapon from an apparently dead soldier, but the soldier suddenly wakes up. He is a walker. Rick quickly shoots the soldier in the head, but then becomes disoriented from a loud shot that rang out inside the tank. When he comes to, he notices his bag of weapons on the street. He opens the hatch at the top of the tank, but he is quickly noticed by several walkers. He closes the hatch when the walkers begin to swarm outside the tank. Completely surrounded by walkers, Rick, not knowing what to do next, decides to try to commit suicide again by putting a gun to his forehead, but before he can do it, he is interrupted by a voice that breaks through the radio in the tank. "Hey, you dumbass. You're in a tank. It's cozy there." A voice speaks. Rick looks up and slowly lowers the gun from his forehead.
In a camp set in a quarry outside of Atlanta, survivors are busy with various tasks. From the roof of an RV, Dale watches the perimeter of the camp. Meanwhile, Amy dumps mushrooms from a bucket into a bowl held by Lori, who sits at a fire pit. Amy asks how to tell if the mushrooms are poisonous, to which Lori replies they would have to eat one to know. Amy, unsatisfied with that method, tells Lori to ask Shane when he gets back. Lori nods, before she excuses herself to look for more mushrooms in the forest. She tells her son Carl, who's playing in the dirt, to stay where Dale can see him. Lori heads into the forest alone, unnerved by the sounds of snapping branches and moving brush, while she bends down to search for more mushrooms. Suddenly, someone grabs her from behind. Lori struggles but soon realizes it's Shane, pinning her down on the ground. They passionately kiss and begin to have sex. In Atlanta, sealed inside a military tank, Rick tells the young man over the radio what he should do. The young man informs him that he is surrounded by walkers and advises him to make a run for it while they're distracted and busy eating his horse. Rick asks if the man on the other end can see his bag of guns, but is told that it's not an option. Rick collects a grenade from the dead soldier and a shovel from the floor of the tank. He pops through the top hatch and dispatches a walker with his shovel, jumps off of the tank, and runs down a nearby sidewalk toward an alleyway, shooting walkers along the way. He turns around a corner and is surprised by a young man, who reveals himself to be the one talking to him earlier over the tank radio. They race up a ladder to the roof, stopping to catch their breath on a platform halfway up. Glenn introduces himself and Rick thanks him for saving his life. Upon walking across the roof, Rick thanks Glenn for saving him, and they walk down a staircase into an alley which is occupied by 2 walkers. Glenn radios his group, prompting to people wearing riot gear and brandishing baseball bats to emerge from the building and beat down the walkers. Rick and Glenn rush into the building, followed by the people in riot gear. Inside the store, Andrea points a gun in Rick's face, furious at his recklessness. Morales informs Rick that his gunshots have attracted the horde of walkers to the doors of the store. A huge horde of walkers are gathered at the doors and windows of the store, furiously pounding at the glass in an attempt to gain entry. The group questions Rick about what he was doing roaming around the streets of Atlanta aimlessly. He tries to explain he was trying to flag down a helicopter. The group say they didn't hear a helicopter. Jackie suggests that it was just a hallucination. T-Dog tries to make radio contact with another unknown group, but fails to get a signal. Suddenly, they hear gunshots from the roof, and they rush to the roof to investigate. On the rooftop, the group finds Merle firing at walkers in the street with a scoped rifle. Morales and T-Dog chastise Merle for wasting bullets and attracting more walkers. Merle scoffs at them and proceeds to racially insult Morales and T-Dog, before punching T-Dog to the floor. Merle then declares himself the new leader of the group and states if there are any objections. In a mocking manner, Rick then suddenly hits Merle in the face with the butt of his rifle and then handcuffs him to a pipe on the roof. He searches Merle for weapons, but instead finds a bag of drugs, which he tosses over the side of the roof much to Merle's anger. Morales informs Rick that there is no safe zone in Atlanta, but they are part of a larger group taking shelter on the outskirts of the city, with the streets unsafe to pass due to the walkers. Jackie suggests they travel underground to escape, as the building will have access to the sewers. As the group travel downstairs, T-Dog stays behind to keep watch on Merle. In the basement, Glenn, Rick, Andrea, Morales, and Jackie stand at the top of a ladder that leads into the sewer. Rick and Andrea volunteer to stay in the store while Morales, Glenn, and Jackie go into the sewer to find a possible exit. On the roof, T-Dog unsuccessfully tries to radio to the group without success. Merle mocks his attempts and tries to persuade him to releasing him from his handcuffs, but T-Dog refuses to. Glenn and Morales travel through the sewer until they reach a grated barrier. They discuss a plan to cut through the grate, until they find a walker devouring a rat on the other side. As the walker attempts to reach at them through the grate, they abandon the idea. In the store, Andrea spots a mermaid necklace and says her sister will love it as it is her birthday soon. Rick encourages her to take it, stating that shoplifting rules no longer apply in this world. Glenn, Morales, and Jackie return and state the sewers are unsafe to travel through. They venture back up to the roof. Rick spots a cube van at a nearby construction site a few blocks away. When discussing plans to bypass the walkers on the streets, Andrea states that the walkers smell dead while they don't, giving Rick an idea. He takes one of the bodies of the walkers Morales and T-Dog dispatched earlier in the alley. They acknowledge the walkers lost humanity. After the group shares a solemn moment of reflection, Rick begins hacking the dead body to pieces with the axe. Rick and Glenn then smear guts on themselves, disgusting everyone. Before leaving, Rick tosses T-Dog the key to Merle's handcuffs. Outside, Rick and Glenn crawl under the bus blocking the alley. They start to shuffle into the streets, mixing into the crowd of walkers unnoticed. Back in the store, T-Dog, Morales, Andrea, and Jackie raced to the roof to follow Rick and Glenn with a pair of binoculars, and T-Dog tries again to radio the others. Back at camp, Amy frets over the whereabouts of the group and her sister, Dale, working on his RV's troublesome radiator hose with Jim. Reasons with Amy that worrying won't make it better. Meanwhile, Lori's doing laundry as Shane teaches Carl to tie knots. Suddenly, the radio crackles and squeaks, and T-Dog's garbled transmission comes through, explaining that they're trapped in the department store, surrounded by hundreds of walkers. Dale responds to the transmission, but only radio silence follows. Amy insists they go to Atlanta to rescue them, but Shane refuses to let any more people go to Atlanta, as it's unsafe, prompting Amy to angrily insult him. Back in Atlanta, Rick and Glenn keep making their way through the crowd of walkers. Suddenly, rain begins to fall rather heavily, beginning to wash the gut smell off of them. A nearby walker detects them as humans and growls at Rick, who in turn dispatches it with his axe. All walkers nearby start to come after them. Rick and Glenn fight the walkers while continuing to run to the construction site where the cube van is. As the group on the rooftop watches, they are able to make it over the fence uninjured. Rick shoots at walkers while Glenn locates the keys. The crowd of walkers knocks down the fence and charges at them, but they speed away in the van just in time. On the roof, the group worries that they're being left behind. Rick orders Glenn to radio the group to get ready for pickup, and mentions that they will need a way to lure the walkers away from the department store. Eyeing a red Dodge Challenger sports car, Rick smashes the driver's side window to gain entry, causing the car's alarm to blare loudly. The group grabs their bags and rushes from the rooftop toward the loading dock, with no concern for unlocking Merle's handcuffs. T-Dog reluctantly turns back as Merle begs and runs with the key in hand to set him free. However, he slips and drops the key down a drain by accident. As Merle angrily curses at T-Dog, he abandons him on the roof, but not before chaining the door so walkers do not find him. Outside the loading bay at the back entrance of the store, with the walkers lured away by Glenn's car alarm, Rick pulls the van up and the group piles in, catching their breath as they drive away from the city. They look around at one another and a guilt-ridden T-Dog admits to the others he dropped the key, leaving Merle trapped on the roof, still handcuffed to a pipe. Andrea then asks where Glenn is. On the road, Glenn drives the red Dodge Challenger and speeds out of Atlanta while screaming in celebration.
In the roof of the department store, a handcuffed and delirious Merle Dixon sits alone, talking to himself about a violent incident from his past. Suddenly, he snaps back to reality and begins panicking as some walkers start to clamor. At the padlocked stairwell door, Merle becomes hysterical, desperately trying to break free. He prays to God for forgiveness and then spots a hacksaw from the overturned toolbox, and his resolve suddenly strengthens. Taking off his belt, he repeatedly tosses the buckle end to try to reel in the hacksaw, lying just out of reach. On the road, Rick is driving to the camp, while Morales advises him not to dwell on Merle's abandonment, claiming that nobody will miss him, except for his brother, Daryl. Rick listens in silence. In the camp, Lori gives Carl a haircut while Shane promises him that they will catch frogs at the quarry, so they can eat their legs. Lori expresses her disgust at the thought, while Shane tells her she'll be begging for more once she tastes them. Their moment is interrupted by the approach of Glenn's Challenger alarm blaring. Amy rushes to Glenn and demands to know if her sister, Andrea, is okay. Dale tells Glenn to turn off the car alarm before walkers hear. Jim disconnects the alarm while Amy continues to ask questions about Andrea. Glenn tells her everyone's okay, except for Merle. Shane chastises him for drawing attention to their location. The cube van arrives. Andrea and Amy tearfully reunite, as do Morales and his wife, son and daughter. Lori and Carl briefly watch the happy reunions before Carl becomes emotional and Lori leads him away. Shane watches them, sympathizing. He then asks Glenn how they made it out of the city. Glenn says a new guy helped them, while Morales adds that he's a police officer. He then tells an exhausted and apprehensive Rick to come meet everybody. Rick emerges from the van and recognizes Shane. The two trade stunned glances as Carl tearfully lifts his head and Lori's eyes follow. He spots Rick and runs into his open arms. Lori stares at Rick, but she tearfully embraces her husband and son. Shane and the rest of his group watch on, dumbfounded. Lori looks up at Shane, who attempts to smile away his obvious pain. Lori cries into Rick's shoulder while Rick turns to smile at Shane, who does manage an honest smile in return. In the night, around a campfire, Rick describes the disorientation he felt waking up alone in the hospital. Lori explains she was told Rick would be brought over to Atlanta, but it never happened. Carl says Shane told him he died. Rick states Shane had every reason to believe he did, and he thanks Shane for looking after his family. Both Shane and Lori shoot awkward glares at each other. Nearby, Ed Pelletier stokes his family's fire with a fresh log. Shane intervenes, instructing Ed to take the log out so they can't be seen from a distance. Ed tells him to mind his own business, but concedes under Shane's forceful command and instructs his meek wife Carol to pull the log from the fire. Ed then glares as Shane bids Carol and their daughter Sophie a good evening. Back at the group's fire, Dale asks what they should tell Daryl about his brother. Andrea reasons that Merle was out of control, but Dale reasons that they can't tell that to Daryl. Rick volunteers to deliver the news, as does T-Dog, still filled with guilt for dropping the key. He tells the group that he stopped to chain the stairwell door before he ran for the van. In their tent, Rick says goodnight to Carl. Rick then takes Lori's hand as he crawls into bed with her. He tells her he knew she and Carl were alive because their photo albums were gone when he returned to their house. Lori smiles and pulls one open. They reflect on their past mistakes and are grateful for the second chance that they have been given. Lori returns Rick's wedding ring, which had been removed when he was in the hospital, and the two discreetly have sex. Outside, Shane, keeping watch on top of the RV, stares with malice and jealousy at Rick and Lori's tent as a thunderstorm builds in the night sky. The next morning, Rick wakes to find a fresh pair of clothes laid out for him inside the tent. He gets up and gets dressed. Outside, he finds Carol ironing his freshly laundered uniform, though she laments how much harder it is without her old Maytag. Rick thanks her for her kindness. Nearby, Glenn mourns as Morales, Dale, and Jim strip the Challenger down for parts, taking gas for the camp's generators. Rick then sees his wife hanging laundry with Andrea and Amy. She asks if he slept okay and grins, saying she didn't want to wake him, before she catches a look in his eye. Shane arrives back at camp with more water, and Rick tells Lori he plans to return to Atlanta. Lori is shocked, but their discussion is interrupted by screams. Carl, Sophia, and Jackie, who had been out walking, run into camp deeply shaken. Sophia calls out for her mother, and the men grab various weapons from the campsite. Rick, Shane, Jim, Morales, and Glenn run past them to a clearing where a walker is devouring a deer with crossbow bolts sticking out of it. Amy and Andrea follow. The 5 men beat on the walker until Dale arrives and decapitates it. Dale wonders why the walker has made it this far up the mountain into the camp. Jim theorizes it is because they are running out of food in the city. The group hears the bushes rustling and Shane raises his gun protectively. Daryl Dixon emerges from the woods carrying a crossbow and hauling over a dozen dead squirrels. He's upset that the walker ate the deer he'd been tracking for miles and the food has been wasted. The walker's decapitated head starts grinding its teeth, growling. Amy and Andrea take off back to the campsite. Disgusted, Daryl fires his crossbow into the walker's head. He mocks the group for not realizing they need to destroy a walker's brain to permanently kill one. He then walks into camp, calling out for Merle. Shane follows, telling Daryl that Merle didn't make it back. Rick chimes in, confessing he left Merle handcuffed to the roof as the group surrounds them. He introduces himself to Daryl, who doesn't want to hear it. Enraged, Daryl throws the dead squirrels at Rick, who ducks as Shane throws Daryl backwards. T-Dog sees Daryl pull a knife and warns Rick and Shane, joining the scuffle. Rick is able to disarm Daryl, and Shane locks him in a sleeper hold. Rick tells Daryl he plans on heading back to Atlanta to find Merle. Later, Rick prepares to leave with Daryl. Rick admits he wants Glenn to come along because of his experience getting in and out of the city. T-Dog decides to tag along as well, to make up for his mistake. Shane argues with Rick that they need everybody to protect the camp in case more walkers show up. However, Rick contends they need more guns, which he'd be able to retrieve from the bag he dropped outside the tank. Shane softens, knowing the value of more guns. But Lori still isn't convinced and continues to plead with Rick not to risk his life for a man like Merle. Rick explains to her that he also needs to collect his walkie-talkie from the bag, so he can warn Morgan Jones away from the city. He claims he owes them his life. Shane also recognizes that the walkie-talkie would be better than their CB. Lori gives up arguing, and Carl tells Rick he's okay with his reasons for going back to Atlanta. Rick and T-Dog cut a deal with Dale for a set of bolt cutters to cut the chains on the door. Dale agrees in exchange of one of the guns Rick intends to collect, while Jim wants to be able to strip the cube van for parts that they can use for the old RV when they get back. Shane then gives Rick the last of his bullets for his revolver. Rick loads his gun in the passenger seat while Daryl drives out of camp and the group watches as they exit the campsite. In their tent, Lori frets about Rick. In Atlanta, the group parks beside a railroad line. Daryl threatens T-Dog if Merle's not okay, but T-Dog insists that the undead can't get through the chains on the door. As they travel on foot below a highway overpass, Glenn decides the group should go for Merle first, because going for the guns would mean doubling back. Back at camp, Lori looks for Carl. Dale tells her he should be down at the quarry catching frogs. In the quarry, Shane and Carl try to catch frogs with a bucket and net. Shane falls in the water trying to drive them to Carl, and instead they splash each other playing. Nearby, Andrea, Amy, Carol, and Jackie do laundry and discuss the division of labor. The women then discuss the luxuries of the pre-apocalyptic world that they miss, with Carol missing her washing machine, Amy missing her mobile phone, Jackie missing her coffee-making machine, and Andrea missing her vibrator, which results in the women burst into laughter when Carol states she misses her too. Lori arrives at the quarry, ordering Carl to return to camp. After he leaves, Shane tells her not to take it out on him, and Lori warned him to stay away from her family. Shane asks Lori if she thinks he's not happy about Rick's return. Lori states Shane was the one who told her Rick died. Ed, frustrated over the women's laughter, approaches them and demands they stop laughing and continue cleaning. Andrea throws the sponge at Ed and refuses to work. Ed then demands that Carol comes with him, but Jackie rebukes that they know of his domestic abuse to Carol. As Ed tries to grab Carol, he slaps her across the face. Shane, upon witnessing Ed slap Carol and still seething over his confrontation with Lori, pulls Ed away from Carol and proceeds to beat him to a bloody pulp. He warns Ed that if he lays another finger on Carol or anyone else in the camp, he will beat him to death. He then leaves Carol to tend to her battered husband on the floor. In Atlanta, Rick, Daryl, Glenn, and T-Dog return to the department store. Daryl kills a walker in the store with his crossbow. They cut through the chain on the stairwell with the bolt cutters and emerge onto the roof. On the ground, the hacksaw sits beside a severed hand with bloodied handcuffs hang from the pipe above. Daryl screams as the others look on helplessly.
Andrea and Amy sit in a canoe on the quarry lake fishing. Amy holds an umbrella to protect herself from the sun. A discussion starts over the type of fishing knot their father used. They realize that their father taught them different fishing knots based on Andrea's need to catch the fish and Amy's need to throw them back. Both women are on the verge of tears before Andrea reminds Amy of their father's rule, no crying. On the boat, as it scares the fish, Amy wonders if their father is alive, as she believes Florida wasn't hit that bad by the apocalypse. Andrea tells her not to worry about it. Nearby, on top of his RV, Dale is keeping watch. He looks through his binoculars and, in a field above the campsite, he sees Jim furiously digging holes into the ground with a shovel. On the rooftop in Atlanta, an enraged Daryl Dixon has just discovered his brother Merle's severed hand on the ground. He angrily points his crossbow at T-Dog, who doesn't show any fear. Daryl eventually relents when Rick pulls his revolver out and aims it at him, telling him that he doesn't care if every walker in the city hears him shoot it. Daryl puts his crossbow down and asks T-Dog for a durag, in which he proceeds to fold up Merle's hand and place it in Glenn's backpack, while T-Dog is grabbing the hacksaw and the numerous other tools from Dale's toolkit. On the rooftop, Daryl follows the trail of Merle's blood along the rooftop. Back at the campsite, Dale approaches Jim in the fields, who refuses to respond as he digs what appear to be graves. Dale's concern mounts quickly when Jim won't take a drink of water, despite the intense summer heat. Amy and Andrea, meanwhile, present the group with their lines of fish. Morales thanks the women, expressing gratitude that his children will have food to eat. Carl asks them if they could teach him how to fish like that, and Lori says she wouldn't argue with that, impressed by the women's efforts. Dale interrupts the excitement to express concern over Jim, and points him out still furiously digging graves on the hilltop in the fields. Daryl shoots another walker with his crossbow and notes that his brother managed to kill 2 walkers in the room one-handed. The trail of blood leads Daryl, Rick, Glenn, and T-Dog to a kitchen, where a blowtorch is burning next to an iron stake weight crusted with skin, the result. They speculate of Merle cauterizing his stump. They believe Merle has left the building. Rick agrees to help Daryl search the streets for his brother. At camp, Shane and the others approach Jim, who still won't explain why he's digging. Lori tells Jim he's scaring Sophia and Carl, and Shane orders Jim to take a break. He swings his shovel at Shane, who tackles him. Subdued, Jim cries over the death of his wife and 2 sons, revealing the only reason why he survived was because the walkers were too busy eating his family. In an abandoned office above the department store in Atlanta, Glenn outlines a plan to retrieve Rick's bag of guns on an old whiteboard. Daryl will watch his back from the store's alley, while Rick and T-Dog cover a second alley that is 2 blocks away. Glenn and Daryl climb down the ladder to the alley, and Glenn drops his backpack while Daryl stays behind to cover him. On the street, Glenn runs towards the tank. Walkers are waking up all around him, but he grabs the bag and Rick's hat without much trouble and heads back toward Daryl. In the alley, a teenager, Miguel, sneaks up on Daryl from behind. Daryl quickly turns and trains his crossbow on the teen, interrogating him about his brother Murrah and telling him to be quiet. Miguel yells for help despite Daryl's warnings. Rick and T-Dog, hearing Miguel's screams, head for the alley. Daryl is jumped by two men, Jorge and Felipe, who have also come for the guns, with which Glenn has just arrived to the alley. He turns to run the other way, but the men grab him and start beating him. They take the bag of guns. Daryl fires an arrow into Felipe's hindquarters, causing him to drop the bag while yelling in pain. Felipe and Jorge instead grab Glenn, throw him in a getaway car while fighting off walkers and drive off, leaving Miguel and the guns behind. Daryl shuts the gate in the alley to keep out the walkers before turning on the teenager. Rick and T-Dog arrive just in time to pull Daryl off Miguel, as Daryl explains that his friends took Glenn. Taking Miguel with them, Rick grabs the bag of guns and his hat, and they head back up the ladder to the roof. At camp, Shane has tied Jim to a tree and is offering him water. Unlike earlier when Dale offered him a drink, this time, Jim accepts it. Lori and Carol are doing schoolwork at a table nearby with Carl and Sophia. Shane tells Jim he's going to keep him tied to the tree until he no longer thinks Jim's a danger to himself or others. Jim apologizes for scaring the children, and Lori forgives him on account of sunstroke. Dale asks why he was digging holes, but Jim cannot remember. He dreamt something is going to happen, and it has forced him to dig holes. Jim warns Lori not to let Carl out of her sight. Back inside the abandoned office building, Rick's looking for answers while a confused T-Dog wonders what they've gotten themselves into. Daryl's still seething over Glenn's kidnapping and getting jumped by Miguel's men. Daryl threatens Miguel by throwing Merle's severed hand in his lap, telling him that's what happened to the last guy who crossed him. Miguel cowers and Rick throws Daryl off him. He just wants to know where to find Glenn, and he manages to convince Miguel to take them to him. Miguel leads Rick, Daryl and T-Dog to an abandoned factory, where the leader of the group, Guillermo, emerges. Rick proposes trading Miguel for Glenn, but has no interest in giving up his bag of guns, with T-Dog aiming a scoped rifle at his head from a nearby rooftop. Guillermo demands the bag of guns, threatening to kill Glenn if they don't hand it over. They shove Glenn on the edge of a rooftop, his mouth covered with tape and his hands tied behind his back. Rick and the group retreat to a nearby foreman's office, where Daryl argues that the guns are more valuable than Glenn, but Rick insists he owes more than that to him. Rick knows how dangerous the mission could be, that he might get killed when he goes back to the factory, and tells Daryl and T-Dog to head back to the campsite. They refuse to let him go alone and also take note that they wouldn't know what to tell his family, so they're to load their guns and grab Miguel. Rick escorts him into the warehouse carrying the guns on his back. Rick cuts Miguel loose and demands Guillermo hand over Glenn. Guillermo tells Rick that he's going to chop up Glenn and feed him to his 3 vicious man-eating dogs. Before the situation can escalate further, an old woman wearing a nightgown, Abuela, shuffles into the middle of the standoff, asking Felipe for help with Mr. Gilbert. She notices Rick's uniform and begs him not to take Felipe away, saying he's turned his life around and they need him here. Rick tells the old woman that Felipe is helping him find a missing person. Abuela assumes he's referring to Glenn and takes him by the hand. Abuela leads Rick into a nursing home auditorium, where several elderly people are grouped around an asthmatic man. Glenn is trying to console the man. Felipe helps the man with an inhaler. Guillermo's 3 vicious dogs are teacup-sized chihuahuas, and they yap at the group as the survivors realize what's really going on. Rick pulls Guillermo aside and confronts Guillermo, stating he was ready to kill everyone in the building for the guns. Guillermo explains he was only trying to protect the food and medicine for the residents. As the staff abandoned the patients, leaving Guillermo and Felipe, the only staff members behind, people trickled in to check on their grandparents, and suddenly he's the leader of a group of young men, women, and the elderly. The group agree to leave some of the guns to Guillermo so he can defend the nursing home. They then leave the nursing home and head back to camp. Back at the camp, the group is preparing for a fish cookout. and Morales proudly shows off the upgraded campfire, with higher rocks to hide higher flames. Carl walks to the tree with Shane, who frees Jim and invites him to the fish fry. Ed, his face bruised and swollen, broods in his tent, declining Carol's invite to join the group for the fish fry. He grabs Sophia's arms and tells her to stay with him. But Carol says forcefully that Sophia is joining in with the fish fry, leaving Ed to angrily curse them as they leave. As the group sit around the campfire after dark, Morales asks Dale why he still wins his wristwatch every day. Jackie agrees that it's pointless, ever since the world ended. Dale tells a story that it is important to keep track of time. Amy heads to the RV to use the bathroom. Ed, meanwhile, hears rustling outside his tent. He thinks it's Carol bugging him to join the group and unzips the flap to yell at her. But instead, he finds a walker. It attacks him, biting his neck as more walkers swarm inside the tent, devouring him. Amy emerges from the RV, complaining that they're out of toilet paper, as a walker approaches from behind the door and bites her arm. Amy screams, and Andrea turns to see her sister being attacked, and she looks on in horror as the camp is sent into a panic. Walkers attack from all directions, grabbing and devouring people all over the campsite. Shane orders Lori to get Carla and everyone else into the RV as he fires his shotgun. Amy screams in pain as a large chunk of her neck is bit by the same walker who bit her arm. Andrea runs for Amy as Jim and Morales beat down walkers with baseball bats. Rick and the others, running toward camp, hear gunshots in the distance and quicken their pace. While back at the RV, Amy is dying from blood loss. Rick, Glenn, Daryl, and T-Dog arrive and quickly shoot the remaining walkers. The survivors begin to catch their breath as Carl runs tearfully into Rick's arms, and Lori looks on, terrified. Andrea, cradling a dying Amy, tries her best to comfort Amy. She eventually dies of blood loss, leaving Andrea to scream in anguish. Dead bodies litter the camp, and as the group recollect themselves, Jim states he remembers why he dug the holes to bury the bodies. The morning after the massacre at camp, Rick stares at the sunrise over Atlanta as he tries to reach Morgan. On the walkie-talkie for the first time, he talks about the attack on the camp and warns Morgan to stay out of Atlanta, as the city now belongs to the dead. At the campsite, Andrea cradles Amy's body next to the RV. Lori tries to comfort her, but she has no success in convincing her to let them take Amy, as she has still not turned yet. Nearby, Daryl swings at dead walkers' heads with a pickaxe as Glenn and T-Dog throw bodies in a fire. Rick, Lori, and Shane discuss how to handle Andrea, who hasn't moved from Amy's side all night. Rick goes to talk to Andrea, but she pulls a gun on him. Rick backs off, apologizing. Daryl tells Rick that he needs to deal with Amy, calling her a time bomb, as she could turn at any moment, but Lori insists they leave Andrea alone. Morales and Daryl drag the body of a dead camper toward the fire, but Glenn stops them. He cries that they should bury their dead. Jackie and Jim pile up bodies. She notices blood on his shirt. He tries to convince her he just got some blood on him by moving bodies, but she manages to see that he has been bit. Jim pleads with her not to tell the group, but a terrified Jackie informs the group. Jim insists that he's fine, but he grabs a shovel to press the group away from him as they demand to see his stomach. T-Dog runs up behind him and grabs his arms as Daryl runs in and lifts his shirt, revealing a bite wound on his abdomen. The group is discussing what to do with Jim, but Rick refuses to kill him. Rick thinks the Center for Disease Control, roughly 25 miles away inside Atlanta, might be able to help, and he suggests relocating there. Shane thinks the Army base Fort Benning, 100 miles in the opposite direction, is a safer bet. Both places would provide food and shelter if up and running. Rick believes Fort Benning got overrun like every other military cordon they've seen. He says the CDC would be Jim's best chance, and points out that in the event of a nuclear disaster or a terrorist attack, they'd protect the CDC at all costs. Daryl heads toward Jim with his pickaxe and tries to take a swing, but Rick points his gun at Daryl's head. Shane steps between Daryl and Jim, agreeing with Rick, and Daryl throws down his pickaxe. Rick moves Jim inside the bedroom of the RV. Dale sits beside Andrea to pay his respects for Amy's death. He tells her about his wife's battle with cancer, how he dragged her to every specialist even though she'd accepted her fate. Her death left him feeling angry and cheated. Andrea smiles and pulls out the mermaid necklace, wrapped in pink tissue paper. Today would have been Amy's birthday. She tells Dale how guilty she feels for having missed so many of Amy's birthdays. She places the necklace on Amy's neck. Nearby, Daryl continues to swing the pick into dead walkers' skulls. He raises the axe over Ed's head, but Carol stops him, insisting she's the one who should do it. Taking the axe from Daryl's hands, sobbing, she swings it down on Ed's skull repeatedly, taking out years of abuse in this final act to ensure he'd never reanimate. Daryl watches in silence, cringing. Amy eventually reanimates as a walker. Andrea, still holding her in her hands, apologizes to Amy. She then shoots Amy in the head, putting her down for good. Daryl believes they should burn all the bodies, but Lori insists that they need time to mourn and bury their dead. Jim is hallucinating inside the RV, his bite bleeding as he sees terrifying visions of the dead. The survivors stage a funeral, and Andrea resists Dale's attempts to help her drag Amy's body into one of the graves. In the RV, Rick tells a feverish Jim they're going to get him help as Jim starts to cough blood into a bucket. Jim is delirious and asks Rick to watch the boat. Rick begins to wonder if saving Jim will be possible as he promises to watch the boat while Jim nods gratefully. Outside, Shane asks Lori to convince Rick that the CDC is a bad decision, cautioning her about choosing her marriage over people's safety. Shane tries backtracking, and Lori abruptly announces that they should follow Rick's plan. Shane's reaction seems to confirm to Rick that something went on between his wife and best friend while he was gone. Rick, Shane, and Dale depart to sweep the forest for walkers. Alone, Shane tries to convince Rick to change his mind about the CDC. But Rick insists they should go to the CDC, as they're interrupted by a sound in the bush and draw their guns and separate to investigate. As they each scan with their guns raised, Shane's aim lands on Rick. He holds it there for just a few seconds, glaring, his breath heavy. But he hears a sound and his focus breaks. He lowers the gun and then notices Dale's been watching him. Shane shrugs it off, musing that they need to get reflective vests for the woods. Back at camp, Shane announces that he thinks they should trust Rick's instincts, and those that agree will be leaving for the CDC in the morning. At dawn, Rick tries to reach Morgan to advise him of their new plan, telling him he needs him to be right about the CDC. He also adds that they will be leaving a map taped to a red car with their route drawn out for him and Dwayne to follow. As the group is preparing to leave, Shane is giving instructions on how to stay with the caravan when Morales announces that his family won't be joining the group. He states that they have family in Birmingham and want to be with their people. Rick hands Morales a .357 Magnum revolver with Shane's terse assumption that the rest of them will fare no better out there. Anyway, and they part ways. Carla and Sophia hug the Morales kids, Eliza and Louis, while Lori tearfully hugs Morales' wife, Miranda. Eliza gives her doll to Sophia and runs back to her family. The group leaves the campsite behind for good, Glenn with the map and Jim's fever worsening in the bedroom of the RV. On their way to the CDC, the RV's radiator hose bursts. While Shane and T-Dog drive ahead to find replacement parts, Rick checks on Jim, who is in agony. Jim knows he is not going to make it, and tells the group to leave him behind. Rick suggests he's delirious, but Jim insists his head is clear. Outside, Dale advocates respecting Jim's wishes. Lori agrees, and the group carries Jim to a nearby tree. Jackie gives him a soft kiss on the cheek. The group departs, tearfully leaving him behind. Elsewhere, a video monitor crackles to life. An unshaven man, Dr. Jenner, speaks into the camera. It's been 194 days since the outbreak began, and 63 days since it went global. In a biohazard suit and with classical music playing, Jenner passes through an airlock into a laboratory. He opens a tissue sample labeled TS-19 and begins an experiment. He takes a nap inside his safety suit while he waits for the sample to be ready for examination. Reaching for a beaker, he accidentally knocks a graduated cylinder of corrosive fluid on the tissue sample inside a Petri dish. An alarm sounds as a voice over a loudspeaker alerts Jenner to toxic quality air, and he runs to a decontamination chamber and disrobes. From the safety of the airlock, Jenner watches helplessly as the voice announces full decontamination in effect. as the lab and all of the remaining TS-19 samples are engulfed in flames. An automatic safety protocol. A despondent Jenner talks in the monitor. Sad that the test samples are gone, and he has no purpose, he decides to commit suicide. But first, he wants to get drunk. Rick's caravan approaches the CDC with the sun setting, where hundreds of bodies lay dead on the ground. The group quietly approaches the building, which is locked and shuttered. Inside, the proximity alarm alerts Jenner. Stunned, he watches the groups approach via security monitor. Outside, walkers begin to take notice of the survivors. Panicking, Shane suggests they can still turn around and head for Fort Benning. Andrea then points out that they're out of gas and they have no food, and would never make it. Lori demands a plan and Rick insists they'll figure something out as the sun sets. Jenner quietly mumbles to himself, telling them to leave. Rick catches sight of the security camera's movement and slams his fists against the metal shutters, screaming to be let in. As the walkers surround the group, the shutters open, shrouding the group in a bright light. A flashback starts this episode at the onset of the outbreak. Shane is visiting Rick in the King County Hospital, wearing his sheriff's deputy's uniform. Army personnel are evacuating hospital staff and executing the infected. Shane begs a nurse for help, but she runs past him screaming. Shane watches fearfully as the military execute terrified people in the hallways. He tries to lift his comatose partner, but hesitates because of all the tubes and wires attached to the machines that are keeping him alive. Shane asks him desperately to tell him what to do, but Rick is unresponsive. He ducks behind Rick's bed just as two army personnel arrive to sweep the room. When they leave, he begs his best friend to wake up, but the power goes out and Rick's monitors die. Fearing the worst, Shane puts his ear to Rick's chest. After hearing no heartbeat, Shane reluctantly leaves Rick in the room. However, he barricades the door with a hospital gurney before he flees. In the present, Rick and the other survivors file into the CDC lobby in Atlanta. Dr. Edwin Jenner meets them at the door. He accepts them to the CDC, but demands they do a blood test first. As the group wander deep into the CDC, Carol notes that she's claustrophobic underground, and Jenner simply advises her not to think about it. Jenner leads the group into the control room. Looking around, Rick questions the absence of other doctors. Jenner states he's the only one left. Lori asks about VI. When Jenner introduces her, the group realizes that she is the voice of the CDC's computer system. As Jenner takes a blood sample from Andrea, she asks him what the point is, as they were bitten. They'd be sick with a fever. Jenner says it's protocol. Later, the group feasts in the CDC cafeteria, joyfully drinking wine and liquor from the fully stocked kitchen. They are beyond happy about finding a safe place to stay and a good meal. Glenn is drunk, much to Daryl's satisfaction. Carl tries his first sip of red wine. He hates it, to Lori's delight. Rick toasts Jenner for his hospitality, and the doctor quietly raises his glass. After dinner, Jenner shows the group around the building, directing the children towards the rec room and telling everyone not to waste electricity. The survivors are thrilled to luxuriate in hot showers, all except for Shane, who angrily swallows a bottle of liquor while he bathes, and Andrea, who sits numbly under the stream. Rick meets with Jenner and thanks him again. He admits to Jenner that he never let on to the others what he really thought, but he knew that they were running out of options before they got to the CDC. Cradling another glass of wine, a buzzed Lori finds Carl, Carol, and Sophia reading books in the rec room. Carol takes the children to bed while Lori stays behind to browse the library. A drunken Shane confronts Lori and is angry with her for abandoning him once Rick arrived. Lori retorts that Shane lied about Rick dying, and because of that, anything between them is now over. Shane attempted fondling her between the legs to satisfy her, only to have his neck and ear clawed by her nail. Later, Rick stumbles into bed with Lori and sees that she's been crying. He assumes that it is of something else, as he is clueless as to what had just happened with her and Shane. The next morning, Rick shuffles into the cafeteria. He, as well as most others, is hungover. T-Dog proudly dishes out powdered eggs for everyone, while a hungover Glenn groans. Lori hands Rick some aspirin, which she says came from Dr. Jenner. Shane enters the room and heads straight for the coffee. T-Dog asks about the scratches on Shane's neck. He shrugs it off, claiming he must have scratched his neck in his sleep. When Jenner arrives in the kitchen, Dale starts asking questions. Andrea concurs, saying, "They didn't come here for the eggs." Jenner leads the group into the control center. He tells VI to display the brain scans from the episode's namesake test subject 19. The top-secret brain scan video shows someone who was infected and allowed the process of reanimation to be recorded by the CDC. Jenner explains, the video shows the sepsis of the brain hemorrhaging before it goes black, as the subject died. The group are saddened to see this, still reeling over the losses of Amy and Jim who have died from a similar event. Jenner fast-forwards to the TS-19's resurrection. The sepsis of the brain slowly lights back up in a dull light. A bullet flies through TS-19's head in the video playback. Andrea reminisces of Amy, whom she, too, had to shoot in the head. He admits he doesn't know what the disease is or how to treat it. He also states that he has lost contact with other research facilities due to loss of power, with the facility in France being the last one he had contact with until they too run of power. Dale interrupts the stunned silence to ask Jenner about a clock on the far wall, which is counting down from an hour. At that point, the basement generators run out of fuel, and VI will conduct a plant-wide decontamination, which will result in the lab exploding to prevent the escape of pathogens. Rick, Shane, T-Dog, and Glenn head to inspect the generators. While they're in the basement, the building's emergency lighting switches on, bathing the four in darkness. Upstairs, Lori and Carl are in their room when the building's air cuts off. In his office, Jenner stares at a photograph of a woman, asking her to understand that he did the best he could in the time that he had. He says that he hopes she's proud of him. With the lights now shutting themselves off inside the panicked survivors' rooms, they confront Jenner in the hallway. He explains that the building is slowly starting to shut itself down. He states that in 30 minutes, the building would decontaminate, and that it is too late to stop it since there is no fuel. Rick yells at the group to grab their things and run as the emergency alarms start blaring. Before they are able to, Jenner locks them inside the control center. He tries to help the case and convince Rick and his group to accept their fate by stating that their deaths would be instant and painless when the building explodes. Daryl and Shane futilely attempt to break through the door with axes and guns, but Jenner states that it's built to withstand a rocket launcher. Rick, T-Dog, and Dale throw Daryl, wielding an axe, off Jenner. Rick talks down Shane as he points an automatic gun in Jenner's defeated and unaffected face. Rick also demands to know why Jenner stayed if he didn't think there was any hope. He reveals that TS-19 was his wife, and she instructed him to hold out as long as he could. Rick and Lori tell Jenner that they just want their chance to keep going as long as they can. Swayed, Jenner agrees to open the door, but also tells them that they still won't be able to get past the lockdown upstairs. Jenner opens the door to the control center. He shakes Rick's hand and pulls him close, whispering something into his ear. The group heads for the exit, but Jackie stops. She wants to stay in the CDC, as she doesn't want to end up in a similar fate as Jim and Amy. Andrea wants to stay too. Unable to convince her to leave, Dale states he is staying too. In the CDC lobby, the group finds the doors locked and they pound helplessly on the windows. Shane shoots a rifle at the glass, to no avail. Carol says she has something that may help, pulling out a hand grenade. She found it in Rick's clothes when she washed them. Quickly, Rick detonates the grenade, blasting out one of the windows with mere minutes to spare before decontamination. In the basement, a resigned Dale sits in front of Andrea, and states he will not leave her in this state. Andrea is furious that Dale is making the decision to die with her. The survivors run to the cars, shooting at nearby walkers as they run. They pile into their cars and are getting ready to drive away when, from inside the RV, Lori sees Dale and Andrea emerge from the building. With just 10 seconds left, Jenner and Jackie hold hands, smiling proudly as they watch the survivors flee on the security monitor. Dale and Andrea run behind a military blockade and take cover as the CDC erupts. In a fiery explosion, Andrea looks numb, but follows easily as Glenn desperately motions them to the RV. Shaken, Rick starts the engine, and the caravan drives away from the smoldering rubble, thick black smoke rising up behind them. The end of Season 1.